Hello, welcome to OnQA. In this session, we are going to talk about the important terms and terminology with respect to LoadRunner and the performance testing. There are so many important terms that we must know before we go and start testing the application for performance testing. Now, in this session, we are going to concentrate and learn about all the important terminology with respect to performance testing and with respect to load runner. So let's get started. So before we go into the actual terminology, we must know the process. So this is the industry standard performance testing process. So we have the web servers, application servers, database servers, and web applications. So while we wanted to test and validate the performance of these applications and these servers, then one of the standard tool in the industry is the load runner. So load runner comes up with three important tools in it: the VU generator, so-called virtual user generator; the second one, controller; the third one, analysis. So virtual user generator is a tool that is being used to create the load runner script so that that script can be enhanced, parameterized, and applied with the checkpoints and can be used to run with multiple sets of virtual users. And controller is the tool where we manage, control, and execute the load runner scripts and load runner scenarios. And once we do that, analysis is the tool where we analyze the reports, where we understand the reports, and then we would generate standard format oriented reports, and that could be shared across the teams. So these are the three important tools with respect to the load runner. Now, since we know this, there are so many important terminology. Now let's go and talk about that. The first thing, as we discussed already, the load testing. So load testing is the process of testing the application to check if the application is behaving uh, as per the requirement, where it supports the required number of users. Example, Google should support 1 lakh users to search and get the results at a time. Google should support the same string to be searched and the results can be applied easily, effectively, and log in, log out. Gmail should support 1 lakh users to log in at the same time or register to the application at the same time. So these are simple examples. So load testing is the process of testing the application to check if the application supports the required number of users. And the next one is performance testing. Performance testing is the process of testing the application to cross-check if the application behaves well with the specified conditions like 8 transactions per second and 2 seconds of response time and the memory consumption, threads, its bytes and much more. The third one is the stress testing. Stress testing is the process of testing the application to cross-check if the application is sustainable, stable, even beyond the limit or beyond the heavy loads of the users or heavy loads of the transactions. Already we have discussed about it. Now with respect to this particular performance testing, we have so many terminology. We uses virtual user generator, controller, analysis, and then scenario, transactions, benchmark, throughput, bottleneck, ramp up, ramp down, rendezvous point, parameterization, checkpoints. So there are several terminology and several things that we need to know before we proceed to implement. Now this is the time, let's go and talk about the important terms and learn them now. The first one is the virtual user generator. So what is virtual user generator? So virtual users are the simulated users. These act as the real users. Virtual users are the simulator users. These users act as similar as the real users. Then why do we need virtual users? We need virtual users because we cannot accumulate the real 1 lakh users for testing. It becomes very tough to gather and implement the test. It's very costly and very spacious oriented, and the results might not be even accurate. To avoid that confusion, to avoid that situation, to save the effort, to save the cost, LoadRunner has a concept called simulation. And that concept would generate virtual users. So virtual users are simulated users which act as a real user. The next one is virtual user generator. Virtual user generator is a tool in the LoadRunner that helps us to create the LoadRunner script so that we can parameterize it, we can configure it, we can update it, we can apply checkpoints with it, and we can use the script to run for any number of virtual users later on. So that is the purpose of virtual user generator. The next one is the controller. So controller is again a tool in the LoadRunner that helps us to manage, control, and execute the LoadRunner script. And LoadRunner script is nothing to be the load test scenarios. We would talk about what is scenario and what is the combination it contains. But as of now, the controller is a tool that helps us to manage, control, and to execute the LoadRunner scripts or the LoadRunner scenarios. The third one is the analysis. So analysis is a tool that helps us to understand and analyze the test results, and then we can use the effective graphs and reports to publish to the larger scale audience. Now the next one is the scenario. So what is scenario? So scenario is the combination of test script, virtual users, and performance conditions, servers, and the much more. I repeat, LoadRunner scenario is the combination of LoadRunner script, the virtual users, the performance parameters, servers, and much more. And what is this and why do we need to have these many things? Example, if I have a script, then I might need to run the same script with 50,000 users or 1 lakh users on 5 servers. And also, we would like to cross check the transactions, the response time, the speed of the application, the response rendering time frames, the hits that it can handle, the bytes that it can generate, the request and response handling times, so many other parameters. And this is all together accumulator we call the load runner scenario. And this scenario needs to be implemented, executed by the controller. And let's talk about the transaction now. So what is a transaction? So transaction is the time frame or transaction or the actions that are performed by the application. Transactions are the measured event. Example, what is the transaction time for a login? What is the transaction time for booking a flight? What is the transaction time to log out? So the time frame to do certain activity or transactions or the actions that are being performed in the application. These are scenarios. And to calculate these scenarios, we have the time frames called as the transactions. The next one we would talk about is the benchmark. The benchmark is the ideal business need. Example, my application should support 10,000 users at a time to log in, to register, to book a flight, or to do something else. Then 10,000 users is the ideal need of the business. So that is called a benchmark. Another example, my application should support 8 transactions per second. My application should respond less than 3 seconds. My application should support 1000 hits per second. So these are all the business needs, and we call the benchmark with respect to LoadRunner or the benchmarks with respect to performance testing. So benchmark is the ideal business need, and it is well defined with the customer specific implementations like the number of transactions, the number of users, the number of bits that it can generate, the hits that it can support, the request and response transfer rate, throughput, and many. And now let's talk about throughput. So what is throughput? So throughput is the average rate of successful message delivery. Throughput is the average rate of successful message delivery. Example, as we request something, there is a response. And how do we calculate the response whether it is proper? So we calculate the throughput. Throughput, what is the successful message delivery from system to a client, from server to the database, from database to a browser, or a browsers to the application server. So we calculate the throughput. So throughput is the average rate of successful message delivery, and it is measured by the bits per second. And then we will talk about the ramp up. So ramp up is the gradual increase in the amount of virtual users. Example, if I wanted to cross check if my application supports 1 lakh users, then I would not continue directly with the 1 lakh user load test. I would start with 50,000 and keep on increasing 1000 by 1000 or 5000 by 5000 or 10,000 by 10,000. So that gradual increase is known to be the ramp up. And we have similarly the ramp down. Ramp down is the gradual decrease of the virtual users for performance testing. So we would use and we would talk about much about the throughput, the benchmark, the transactions, the scenario, ramp up, and ramp down. So let's go and see few more the terminology with respect to this. The next one is the bottleneck. So what is bottleneck? So bottleneck is the maximum limit over the benchmark. Bottleneck is the maximum limit over the benchmark. My benchmark says 1 lakh users to be supported. My benchmark says 8 transactions per second. My benchmark says the response time should be 3 seconds. Can we cross it? What if tomorrow there are 1 lakh plus users? Can the application support? What if there are more requests? Can the application render in 9 transactions per second or 12 transactions per second? What if can application respond in less than 2 seconds? So benchmark is an ideal business need, whereas bottleneck is the maximum limit of the application that it supports with respect to virtual users, with respect to transactions, with respect to response time, with respect to all the benchmark needs. So bottleneck is the maximum limit over the benchmark, or the bottleneck is the extended limit that is being supported by the application. Then we would talk about the next one called transaction start time and transaction end time. So what is transaction start time? So transaction start time is the start point from where the actual measurement begins. The transaction start point is the time where the transaction or the action begins. The calculation would also begin. Transaction endpoint is the point where the transaction ends, so that the time frame is calculated between the start point to end point. Example, I wanted to calculate what is the transaction point for a login. So before I fill up my data, until my fill up and login into the application, so there is a starting point and ending point. Between that point, there is a time frame, and that time frame is the transaction time. And whenever we measure the transaction time, we have the transaction start point and we have the transaction end point. The difference between the endpoint and start point, or the length between transaction start and end point, or the actual transaction times for that action. And then we will talk about the think point. So think point or think time is the actual synchronization time. So think time is the time where the real user need to wait between the actions. We'll talk about it later. And then the next one is the rendezvous point. And what is this rendezvous point? So rendezvous point is a point or a waiting point where the load runner instruct all the virtual users to wait at a point until everybody reaches that point. From there, it can continue to simultaneously apply load on the system. So that point is known to be the rendezvous point. I repeat, rendezvous point is the waiting point or a pass point where the load runner instruct all the virtual users to wait at a point, so that while everybody reaches that point, then all can at a time simulate the load on the system. So that point is known to be the rendezvous point. So this particular rendezvous people call in many terms, rendezvous point or rendezvous point or rendezvous point. It's up to you, and you can call that by any of the terminology, but I used to pronounce as a rendezvous point. So let's talk few more things now. Since we are clear with the so many terminology, I just wanted to explain you few requirements. Does the application respond quickly in 3 seconds? Will the application handle the expected user load? Will the application handle the number of transactions which are specified? Is the application stable under expected and unexpected conditions or user hits? Is the application stable under the expected and unexpected heavy loads? Are you sure that users will have a positive experience on the global application which is on live? So these are all simple questions that we need to discuss, understand when we go and talk about or test the performance testing. And anyway, we are going to talk about it. And this is the load runner testing process. So plan your script, design it, and then in the controller, plan a goal oriented scenario or the manual scenario, and then execute it. Run the scenario with a couple of load scripts, virtual users, servers, performance conditions, everything, and then analyze the results and then publish the results. So this is the systematic load runner testing process with respect to load runner. So since we are clear with the load runner terminology, the load runner tools, load runner testing process, in the next session, we are going to talk about how do we initiate and get started with the load testing process. So thank you so much. Thanks for watching the video. Please visit onq.com. So let me summarize what we have discussed in this session. So in this session, we have talked about the important load runner terminology and the performance load runner terminology. We talked about the bottleneck, we talked about the benchmark, we talked about transactions, we talked about throughput, we talked about users, we talked about view generator, controller, analysis, we talked about ramp up, ramp down, we talked about think time, we talked about rendezvous point, we talked about transaction start point, transaction end point, transactions, and much more. So these are all very important terminology. Now by this time we know all the meanings and definitions with respect to all the things required for performance testing. Since we are good with that, in the next session we would continue to start creating the load script, and then we would understand how do we record, how do we play back, what are the different things that we need to know, and how do we use the effective performance scripting, how do we create the load runner scenario, how do we monitor the results, and how do we continue the other goal oriented scenarios. So there are so many things that we need to go and learn and implement. and we are going to do about each and everything down the line. And at this point of time, we have just finished all about the important terminology and the definitions with respect to performance testing and the terminology with respect to load runner. So thank you so much. Thanks for watching the video. Please visit earnq.com. There are so many videos, presentations, articles, books, and PDFs with respect to automation, test management, performance testing, and functional testing. So thank you so much and see you again.